Picture New York City in the summer of 1896. Not the postcard version, the real one. The streets smell like manure and rot because horses are collapsing in the heat and dying where they fall, too heavy to move quickly, left bloating in the sun for hours. The tar between cobblestones has turned soft and black and sticky. Inside the tenements of the Lower East Side, 6 people share a single room barely larger than a modern bathroom. Brick walls that absorb the day's heat and now radiate it back through the night like an oven that never turns off. There are no fans, no ice. The shared outdoor toilet serves dozens of families and cooks in the same heat that is slowly killing people in their beds. In under 7 days, the heat will kill more than 1,500 New Yorkers. Most of them will simply not wake up. This morning you adjusted your thermostat without looking up from your phone. Most history books skip right past the part where summer used to be genuinely lethal, not metaphorically, not occasionally, but reliably, annually, and for thousands of years. If that kind of hidden history pulls at something in you, you're in the right place. Subscribe so you don't miss where this one goes, because it gets much stranger before it gets familiar. Let's go back further, much further, before we get to the machine that changed everything. Before the factories, before the refrigerants, before the moment in a Brooklyn printing plant in 1902 that quietly redirected the entire course of human civilization. The man who did it was 25 years old, had been given the job to fix warped paper and had no idea he was solving a problem that humanity had been losing to for 5,000 years. We need to understand what summer actually felt like for most of human history. The story of air conditioning is not really an inventor story. It is a survival story that most people have never been told. Cities, almost from the moment they existed, were thermal traps. Think about what a city actually is structurally. Dense concentrations of stone and brick and packed dirt, with narrow streets that block wind and funnel heat. Animals and humans crowded into small spaces, generating body heat, burning fuel for cooking and light, producing waste that decomposed in the warmth. Ancient Rome at its peak had somewhere between 1 and 2 million people living in a city designed for a fraction of that number. The wealthy, including senators, merchants, and landowners, had solutions. They left. They owned hilltop villas outside the city specifically to escape the summer heat, retreating to higher elevations where the air moved and the stone stayed cool. They had options. The urban poor, crammed into the Roman insulae, the multi-story apartment blocks that lined Rome's dense neighborhoods, had absolutely nowhere to go. The Roman insulae are worth pausing on, because they were one of history's first experiments in urban density, and they were brutal in summer. Upper floors were hotter because heat rises, cheaper because they were harder to reach and more dangerous to live in, and more crowded because that is where the people with the fewest options ended up. Residents cooked over open fires in rooms with minimal ventilation. The walls held the heat like a cast-iron pan. Roman writers documented the summer misery of the city's lower classes directly. Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century, described the noise, the filth, the heat, and the danger of Rome's apartment life with a disgust that still reads as visceral today. For the people who could not leave, summer was something to endure, not enjoy, and they did try to solve it. That part is important. In ancient Egypt, long before the Roman Empire existed, people had already noticed a simple physical fact. Moving air feels cooler than still air, especially if that air has passed over something wet. Egyptian households hung moistened reeds and woven mats in their windows. As the hot desert breeze came through, it passed across the wet surface, and the water evaporated, pulling heat out of the air in the process. The room did not become cold, it became slightly less unbearable. This was evaporative cooling, the same physics that makes sweat functional, and people figured it out thousands of years ago by paying close attention to what their bodies were telling them. It worked, within limits. The limits were that it only functions when the incoming air is dry. It does almost nothing in humid climates, and it requires someone, almost always a woman or a servant, to keep the reeds wet throughout the day. The coolness, such as it was, had a labor cost baked directly into it. It always did. Across the ancient and medieval world, the strategies for managing heat followed the same basic logic. Exploit what already exists, and accept enormous labor costs to do it. Wealthy Romans circulated cold water through pipes in the walls of their bath complexes. Some affluent households built underground rooms or used basements for sleeping during the worst summer nights. Medieval Europeans, particularly in southern climates, made cellars a routine part of summer life, retreating below ground during peak afternoon heat the way we might retreat to a shaded porch. This was not considered unusual. It was seasonal common sense passed down through generations as naturally as knowing when to plant crops. And then there was ice. The story of ice before mechanical refrigeration is one of the stranger forgotten industries in human history, and it deserves more than the footnote it usually gets. Natural ice, cut from frozen lakes and rivers in the depths of winter, had been harvested and stored by wealthy households for centuries. In ancient Persia, sophisticated structures called yakhchals, large domed buildings with thick insulated walls and underground storage chambers, were used to store ice and snow harvested from nearby mountains, keeping it viable through the summer months. Persian engineers were solving the thermal storage problem in ways that would not be matched in the Western world for over 1,000 years. In colonial-era Europe and America, wealthy estates sometimes maintained ice houses, typically underground pits or stone structures packed with sawdust or straw, which slowed the melting just enough to keep ice viable for months. Ice in summer was an aristocratic luxury, a sign of resources, of planning, of staff to manage the harvest and the storage and the careful rationing through the hot months. But the transformation of ice from a rich person's novelty into a functioning industry is largely the story of one deeply strange man from Boston named Frederic Tudor. Tudor was 22 years old in 1806 when he had the idea, widely considered insane by everyone who heard it, to harvest ice from the frozen ponds of Massachusetts in January, ship it by sailing vessel across the Atlantic and down to the Caribbean and beyond, and sell it in places that had never seen natural ice in living memory. His contemporaries thought he would lose his money and disappear. He nearly did, many times. He went to debtor's prison. His early shipments arrived to discover there was no infrastructure to store the ice once it landed. No ice houses, no insulated containers, nothing. He had to build the entire supply chain himself, teaching local merchants in Havana and Martinique and Calcutta how to store what he was selling them. It took decades, but it worked. By the middle of the 19th century, Frederic Tudor, now known as the Ice King, had built a global ice shipping empire. Workers cut enormous blocks from Massachusetts lakes like Fresh Pond and Spy Pond every winter using specialized horse-drawn saws, then stacked the blocks in massive ice houses insulated with sawdust, then loaded them onto ships bound for ports across the United States, India, Brazil, and beyond. The ice trade employed thousands of workers. It was one of Boston's largest industries, and it was built entirely on the physical labor of men working in brutal January cold, cutting frozen water by hand, moving hundreds of pounds of ice per shift, day after day through the winter months so that wealthy households could cool their drinks in July. Here's the thing about the ice trade, though. Even at its peak, it was a system that served the wealthy and left almost everyone else exactly where they had always been. An icebox, the insulated wooden cabinet that used harvested ice to keep food cool, was a middle-class purchase at best. Ice delivery, a regular feature of urban life in the 1870s and the 1880s, cost money that working families in tenements often could not reliably spend. And ice only cooled a box, not a room. It made food safer. It made a drink cold. It did nothing about the heat that sat in the walls at night, nothing about the air in the factories, nothing about the 6 people sleeping in a room where the temperature had not dropped below 85 degrees since June. The physical consequences of that reality were not abstract. Every summer, infant mortality in American cities surged in ways that are almost incomprehensible to look at now. Milk spoiled within hours of delivery on a hot day. Contaminated milk fed to infants caused diarrhea, dehydration, and death. A cycle that played out across thousands of families every summer, reliably, predictably, and for decades without adequate intervention. Summers were when yellow fever swept through cities, when cholera moved through crowded neighborhoods, when typhoid followed contaminated water made more dangerous by the heat. Cities planned around it. Newspapers tracked the summer death toll the way they tracked weather. It was a known season of dying. There is a detail almost entirely absent from popular history that is worth naming directly. Mental institutions and hospitals across the United States and Europe recorded measurable spikes in patient deaths during heat waves. The people with the least ability to regulate their own circumstances, the elderly, the ill, the imprisoned, the institutionalized, died in significant numbers every summer, in buildings designed with almost no consideration for the lethal potential of heat. These deaths were recorded. They were reported. And they were, for a very long time, simply accepted as the cost of summer. By the late 1800s, engineers and scientists understood the basic mechanics of mechanical refrigeration. Industrial refrigeration machines were large, complicated, and expensive, and they used refrigerants like ammonia and sulfur dioxide that were genuinely toxic. These machines existed and were being used for cold storage of meat and food. A few elite buildings and hospitals had experimented with routing cooled air through ventilation systems. The physics was understood. The machinery existed. But here is where it stalls. Nobody was seriously trying to solve the problem of cooling a room full of human beings. The engineering challenge felt both expensive and unnecessary. The wealthy had summer homes. The working class had always endured. The machinery was too large, too dangerous, too costly to scale down to anything resembling human use. Progress was not just slow, it had effectively stopped. The problem of human comfort in summer heat was not being treated as a problem worth solving. Remember that 25-year-old engineer? He was not trying to solve any of this. He was standing on a foggy train platform in Pittsburgh, watching moisture form in the cold air, thinking about paper. Until someone walked into a printing factory in Brooklyn with a humidity problem and accidentally changed everything. In the summer of 1902, a young engineer named Willis Carrier was standing on a fog-covered train platform in Pittsburgh, watching moisture condense in the cold air around him, and something clicked. Not a metaphor. He was not trying to save anyone from the heat. He was trying to save a print run. The relationship between temperature, moisture, and dew point, the kind of thing most people walk past without registering. Carrier registered it, because the paper was warping and warped paper cost money. And what he went home and built changed the world. But not in the way the inventor story usually gets told. The company that hired him had a problem. Sackett Wilhelm's Lithography, a printing company in Brooklyn, was losing money every summer. Not because their workers were suffering, though they were, but because the paper was warping. Summer humidity caused the paper stock to expand and contract unpredictably, and when paper warps mid-run, the ink does not align. Color printing in 1902 required multiple passes through the press, one color at a time, and if the paper had shifted even a fraction between passes, the final image blurred. Carrier's assignment was to fix the paper. Human comfort was not part of the brief. What he designed was a system that controlled humidity by passing air over chilled coils, removing moisture from the air in a stable, repeatable way. Cooling was almost incidental. The real innovation was humidity control. He called it an apparatus for treating air. He was 25 years old. Here's the part that almost never makes it into the headline version of this story. That machine sat in factories and industrial buildings for nearly 2 decades before anyone seriously considered putting it somewhere humans were meant to be comfortable. The early decades of mechanical air conditioning were not a story of human relief. They were a story of protecting paper, tobacco, textiles, and film stock. The technology that would eventually liberate hundreds of millions of people from lethal summer heat spent its first 20 years keeping cigars from drying out. And Willis Carrier himself gets complicated when you look closely. He is called the father of air conditioning with some legitimacy. His 1906 paper formalizing the psychrometrics of air treatment was genuinely foundational, and the company he eventually co-founded, Carrier Corporation, became the industry's dominant force. But mechanical refrigeration had been developing for decades before him. John Gorey, a Florida physician, had built a working ice-making machine in the 1840s to try to cool fever patients. The United States Patent Office granted him a patent in 1851, and the medical establishment largely ignored him. He died in obscurity in 1855. The engineering lineage that led to Carrier ran through multiple inventors across multiple countries. What Carrier did was systematize, stabilize, and publish. He turned a collection of existing science into a reliable, scalable engineering discipline. That matters enormously. But it is different from inventing something from nothing, and the difference is worth holding on to. So if the factories got it first, how did air conditioning finally reach ordinary people? The answer involves Hollywood, department stores, and a calculated decision to sell coolness as an experience before anyone could afford to own it. The first time most Americans encountered mechanical cooling in a space designed for human occupation, they were watching a movie. Starting in the early 1920s, movie theaters began installing air conditioning systems, not uniformly and not cheaply, but strategically. The Rivoli Theater in New York was an early adopter in 1925. What followed was a cultural shift that was partly comfort and partly marketing genius. Studio distributors realized that theaters with air conditioning could drive summer attendance that previously did not exist. Before mechanical cooling, summer was the dead season for cinema. Audiences stayed away from stuffy, hot indoor theaters. After cooling was installed, studios began deliberately scheduling major releases for summer to pull audiences into the cool dark. The summer blockbuster, that entire cultural institution, exists because of air conditioning. The economics of Hollywood were literally restructured around the availability of chilled air. Department stores followed the same logic and made it explicit. Cool air became a retail strategy. The idea was direct and effective. If you can make a customer physically comfortable, they stay longer and spend more. The technology that had spent 20 years serving industrial production was now being deployed as a tool of consumer persuasion. And it worked. People who had never experienced mechanical cooling in their lives stepped into a Macy's or a Marshall Field's on a sweltering August afternoon and stood still for a moment, just breathing. That sensation, that specific relief, was new to them in a way that is almost impossible to reconstruct now. But notice who's still being left out. The people who needed cooling most, the urban poor, the factory workers, the tenement families, were not the ones sitting in movie theaters or shopping in department stores on a Tuesday afternoon. They were still hot. The technology had arrived in public life, but it arrived first for people with disposable time and disposable income. Early home air conditioning units in the 1930s cost roughly the equivalent of a new car. A window unit in 1938 ran somewhere around $350, in an era when the average American household income was under $1,500 a year. Coolness had graduated from industrial necessity to a luxury commodity, but it had not yet become something ordinary people could actually have. The thing that finally changed the trajectory wasn't a new invention, it was a new refrigerant. Early mechanical cooling systems ran on ammonia, sulfur dioxide, or methyl chloride. These compounds worked. They absorbed heat efficiently and cycled well. They were also toxic. Ammonia leaks in industrial settings were dangerous, and in a home they could be lethal. Several residential refrigerator accidents in the 1920s killed people, and the public's wariness of mechanical cooling in private spaces was not irrational. Then, in 1930, chemist Thomas Migley Jr. demonstrated a new class of refrigerants, chlorofluorocarbons, soon marketed under the trade name Freon. Freon was stable, non-toxic at normal exposure levels, non-flammable, and easy to handle. It made residential cooling safe enough for consumer adoption. It also, as we discovered decades later, turned out to be catastrophically damaging to the ozone layer, but that consequence was invisible at the time, and the more immediate consequence was that the last major barrier to home air conditioning had been removed. World War II paused the consumer market. Materials were rationed and manufacturing was redirected. But after the war, the adoption curve accelerated with a speed that reshaped the physical geography of the United States. Here's a fact that deserves more attention than it gets. Phoenix, Houston, and Miami did not become major American cities because of culture or commerce or infrastructure planning. They became major cities because air conditioning made them survivable for year-round dense human habitation. Phoenix's population in 1950 was under 107,000. The man who fixed the warped paper in Brooklyn had no idea any of this was coming. By 1960, it had more than tripled. By 1980, it was approaching 800,000. That growth did not happen because the desert suddenly became more hospitable. It happened because the technology to override the desert had become affordable and available. The Sunbelt population explosion is, at its root, an air conditioning story. The entire political weight of the American South and Southwest, the congressional seats, the electoral votes, and the economic output shifted in the second half of the 20th century, partly because of a refrigerant cycle and a fan. Architecture changed in ways that are now so normalized most people don't even see them. Before widespread mechanical cooling, buildings were designed around natural ventilation. High ceilings let hot air rise away from occupants. Thick walls slowed heat absorption. Deep, overhanging eaves blocked direct sun. Sleeping porches were standard features on American houses. Windows were designed to open on opposite sides of a room to create cross breezes, passive cooling that worked reasonably well in moderate climates and partially in others. After air conditioning became standard, that entire vocabulary of architectural thinking dissolved. Ceilings dropped. Windows sealed. Buildings turned inward. The assumption of mechanical cooling became so embedded in construction that modern buildings, in many cases, cannot be adequately ventilated without it. We built an infrastructure of total dependence and didn't notice until the power went out. And then there are the human consequences that don't show up in the technology histories at all. Infant mortality, which spiked every summer for centuries as milk spoiled and disease spread through the heat, dropped measurably as refrigeration and cooling became widespread. Foodborne illness declined. Sleep quality improved. Sleep scientists have since documented the relationship between ambient temperature and sleep architecture, and the ability to control nighttime temperature genuinely changed how well people rested. Mental institutions, which had recorded summer mortality surges for over a century, saw those spikes flatten. For women working inside homes, the change was quieter and almost entirely unacknowledged. Domestic labor in an uncooled house in July was physically punishing in a way that's hard to overstate. Cooking over a stove, managing laundry, caring for children in rooms that regularly exceeded 90 degrees. The arrival of cooling in domestic spaces reduced a specific category of physical suffering that was predominantly borne by women and almost never discussed in the language of labor or dignity. It got folded into the broader consumer narrative about modern convenience, which was partly accurate and partly a way of not looking directly at what had actually been endured. Sleep, food, architecture, population distribution, the structure of the entertainment industry, the economics of retail, infant survival rates, the political map of the United States, summer mortality, the lives of people who worked in homes. These are not incidental effects of a single engineering improvement. These are the fingerprints of a technology that reached into the most basic conditions of daily life and rearranged them. The thermostat you adjusted this morning, the one you reached for without thinking, possibly while still half asleep, sits at the end of a 5,000-year argument between human beings and summer heat. It runs through Egyptian wet reeds hanging in window frames, through Roman emperors packing mountain snow into palace gardens, through ice cutters working frozen New England lakes in January so that someone in Calcutta could have a cold drink in August, through a physician in Florida who built a working cooling machine and died ignored, through the humidity warping paper in a Brooklyn printing house, through the first audiences who walked into a cool movie theater on a hot afternoon and stayed not for the film, but for the air. A 25-year-old engineer was standing on a train platform thinking about paper. He was not trying to change civilization. He was trying to fix the problem directly in front of him. That is usually how the large consequences arrive. Quietly through someone who decided to take a small problem seriously. The heat was always out there. It always will be. What changed was that someone, for reasons that had nothing to do with your comfort, finally decided to do something about it.